you go online, you hear everything, but people say like, you're finding a job should be your full-time job. And I always lament that on this podcast because I'm like, you really think that you could be your own boss and not drive yourself insane for 8 hours a day? Welcome back to the Career Therapy Podcast, where we explore the emotional and promotional sides of the job search in order to help you build your career with a cool, calm confidence. My name is Martin McGovern, career and mental health coach and founder of Career Therapy, an all-inclusive coaching program to support you through moments of intense professional stress. I'm excited to welcome Jeff Perry to the podcast. Jeff is the founder of More Than Engineering, where he serves as a leadership and career coach for engineers and technical professionals, helping them make intentional career upgrades. He loves helping people level up their mindset, get clarity, and execute on their biggest goals. Today, we discuss the question, what do I want to be when I grow up? Which we hear from both younger and older people alike. While exploring this topic, we touch on imposter syndrome, ideas around fake it till you make it, career clarity, ignoring the shoulds in life, and how to navigate the subjective disconnect that comes with untethering our imagination from reality. If you are enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes or share this episode with a friend. And if you need help in your job search, head to careertherapy.com to learn about our coaching options. And without further ado, here's my convo with Jeff Perry. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today.
Martin, glad to be here.
Yeah. So we are tentatively titling this episode, what do I want to be when I grow up? It's a question that I've heard so many times recently, and I know has come up in your practice quite a bit. And I'd love to just kick things off and get a sense of, who are the typical people that you're working with, and what are the questions that they have most top of mind when they reach out to you?
Yeah, so glad to be here, Martin. And it's fun. I get to serve. I founded a company called More Than Engineering, and I get to serve primarily engineering and technology professionals. It's kind of the niche because I have an engineering technology background myself. And so sometimes engineers are weird. They like to talk to someone who kind of knows where they've been and been there in their shoes a little bit. And so what a lot of people that I work with to answer this question are in some way or form unsatisfied with their current career situation. Okay. And that can take a lot of different forms, but sometimes it's just like what we were talking about titling this episode, like, hey, I've been doing things for a few years, but I still don't really know where I want to go or what I want to be when I grow up. and that's kind of a high level thing. I've had other people are like, hey, I'm trying to find my happy place in my career, but I don't know what that is or what that looks like. Others are like, I know that I'm unhappy where I'm at now because they feel like they're getting stuck or they reach some sort of plateau in their current position. They don't see a growth opportunity or something like that. They're just like, how do I figure out what that next step even is? Because engineers can take so many different directions in their career. And really, it's not just engineers. Anyone can take so many different directions in their careers. And figuring out how do we make the best choice we can right now in this moment and work towards what we want to become in the future is a tough thing to do, but it's worth doing that work and exploring that if we want to have happy, fulfilled careers and really lives.
Absolutely. Well, and, it brings me to a question that has come up quite a bit in my group coaching, which is an unfortunate question, I think. People will sort of, vent or lament and put everything out there, which definitely encourage. You got to get it out of your head somehow. But then they kind of just look up and go, okay, there's everything. What's the answer? What's the thing I should do? And I always find that to be such an interesting question because, there are clear-cut things you could do, right? Coaches have a toolbox. We have tons of things we could recommend you do, but we don't necessarily have answers, right? We don't have like, oh, you should absolutely take this job and not that job. And we could call out red flags all day, but I'm curious, have you gotten that sort of pressure to give people a solid answer versus having them come up with answers on their own? And how do you navigate those conversations, and because you want to empower people, right? So how do you not take away that decision-making power from them and actually empower them to make decisions when they feel like there's too many directions and they don't know how to make a choice?
Yeah, and that's a tough place to be in from a coach standpoint, because I think you would probably agree that what we would rather do as coaches, like you said, is empower people to make those decisions. Because what they do when people are making those decisions, they take ownership of that. And sometimes if they're pushing that decision to someone else, like a coach or a mentor or someone else to make that decision, and they don't really own that. And so if something doesn't go right, then they're like, oh yeah, well, someone else told me to do that. It was bad advice. And I blame them instead of taking personal ownership for your career. So always want to empower people to make those decisions and take ownership of their life and their career for what they want to get out of it. Right. And the coach is there to help and guide them. So I have had occasionally people who will attempt to do something like that, try and get me to point the things out. Sometimes what I will do to try and help them do that from my side is I can recognize as they're talking about different options and things, I do attempt to share with them how I notice the ways that they're talking about different options and the way that their excitement level goes up or down or sideways and things like this, and the way they're talking about it. So I just sort of notice that and will sometimes share that with them, not to give them an answer, but to say, hey, I notice that when you're talking about this potential option, the way you're doing that, it just gets you really excited. Does that resonate with you? That feel good? And I don't give them that answer like, hey, that's the way you want to go. But I do try and give them what I can as a third-party observer as they're talking about different things, some insights and things. And I always have more questions to ask them to dive deeper. And that's some of the things that I hope we talk more about in our conversation today is really how do we get this idea of career clarity is something I work with people a lot. How do we get clarity about where we want to go, what we want to do, and why? What is it and why is that so important? How do we move through that in the various moments of our lives as we continue to make these decisions?
Yeah, I love that. I like that third party observer piece that you just mentioned too, because it really is it's kind of like being a mirror, and we're a mirror that's listening and listening to what you said 20 minutes ago and connecting it to what you're saying now, because a lot of times the clients are in stream of consciousness, and being able to sort of suss that out is really helpful for them. And I do think that it's tough to, I mean, it's almost like marketers have a hard time marketing themselves, right? It's hard to do, even if you're capable of doing the work, it's hard to do it on yourself. And that's why it's good to engage with coaches or therapists or, whatever the flavor is that you're going after. But this idea of career clarity that you bring up, it's totally central, right? And I guess let's start with what obscures clarity. What gets in the way of people feeling clear? Let's start there, and then maybe we can work our way over to things that we can do to gain a little bit more clarity.
Yeah, Martin, I think you mentioned some of those things is like sometimes working on ourselves is some of the things that obscures clarity, like getting out of our own heads. I think about analysis paralysis when we look at all the potential directions we could take, and we want to have all the options in front of us, and then we get to the place where the amount of options and the directions we can take just overwhelm us. Then we get to that overwhelming state, and we don't even take any action to move forward. And also, like, fear is a huge thing that can drive people to not take action and obscure this thing. We feel like if we have this fear, if we make the wrong choice about taking this job or that job or trying to go to a different role or different industry, or we fear sometimes that if we make the wrong choice, that it's going to devastate the rest of our lives in one way or another. And that fear can then lead us to then actually, it can actually make things worse rather than being driven more by the opportunity. And it's not to say that all fear is bad, right? I'm not one who's going to say that all fear is bad, but if fear cripples us from taking action, then that's when fear becomes unhelpful. Whereas there is absolutely a dose of healthy fear that's supposed to be protecting us from dangers, right? But when fear cripples us from taking action, and that's when it becomes unhealthy or unhelpful. right? And so these are just some of the things that can cripple us or make it hard to get that clarity. And it's not, when I talk about clarity, even defining like what it is, sometimes even understanding what it is or what it could be can also obscure things. Like what we're not going to be able to do most likely is it's not going to turn into like this magical treasure map where we're going to map out the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years of our life and career and have every step along the way with X marks the spot and here's the perfect path to get there. That's not what I'm saying either. But can we get to the point where we can understand, maybe more like a North Star? I know the direction where I'm headed. I have this guiding light to take me. Also, another analogy I like to use sometimes is like, can you get clear on the things that are really most important to you? So when you are analyzing or looking at different options or roles or interviews that you're in and companies that you might want to work for, can you use that as a set of filters? And do they meet those criteria? Those things that you've identified are really important to you in terms of values, work-life balance. Certainly there's compensation pieces and things that might be important to you at your stage of life. But all the other factors in line, can you get clear on those things so that you can run that as a filter so you can focus in on things that meet those criteria and not waste any time on things that don't, right? And those filters, those things can change. Clarity, our idea of clarity now will change in a year and 5 years from now, and that's okay. It's not a one-time piece of work that we do to get clarity. We continue to iterate through this as we go through our lives and careers.
Yeah, I like that. And because really at the end of the day, it's confidence. Clarity is also wrapped up in confidence, right? It's like,
Sure.
I'm clear on what I need to do next, and I'm confident I'll figure it out once I get to that next place, right? Like
Yes.
First, like a resume, and then the interview, and then the negotiation, and then the job. And once I'm in that job, I need to gain clarity on where this job is going and then what's after it and so on and so forth. So it is constantly changing. And I'm glad that you brought up the values piece because, when it comes to values or work-life balance or compensation, I would like to break it down to these like 3 P's of pay, people, and position. How do you prioritize these things? Do you want the most money right now? If you had those 3 options in front of you, one had the most money, one had the best people, and one had the exact right role, which would you put at the top of the list? And that helps people clarify things a little bit. But I do think that this clarity thing is so tough because we're not really, I think people want to be a static human that doesn't change, with a static emotion that never changes and a static career that never changes. But then you talk to someone who's been in a job that's been pretty stable and static, and all they can talk about is how it's boring and they want out, right? And so we're in this like constant state of flux. And I actually had a call with someone this morning and they said, I just need to find the right ratio between like my work and my like self work. And I go, a perfect ratio. The ratio changes day to day, week to week, year to year. There's never going to be a static ratio. You can't just say, I'm going to spend this many hours doing this and this many hours doing that, and it'll never change forever. Right. And I think that's one of the sort of societal things that we're dealing with, right? It's like this concept that there is this like endpoint, that if we could just get to this endpoint, everything works itself out and everything is fixed and everything is fine. But you see people get to these fixed points and then all they see ahead of them is another thing, right? It's like, I think this morning they said, I just want to be like, I think if I could just get these things set, I'll be happy. I'm like, yeah, you'll be happy for today. And then tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up and have a new goal. And then you're going to be unhappy that you haven't hit that goal yet. So accepting those things, I think, is also really important. How have you seen acceptance play into the way that you work with people and how they've kind of come to understand themselves and their careers?
Yeah, what you're talking about, I see all the time. And one of the words or concepts that it makes me think of is this idea of like, we have this drive for certainty. Like we want to know, like we don't want to deal with uncertainty. Makes me think of a quote, a psychologist by the name of Virginia Satir decades ago. He said, many of us prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. Right. And think about that for a moment. Like, I would rather be in something that I know, that I'm comfortable with, even if it's miserable sometimes, rather than stepping out into the unknown and dealing with that uncertainty. For some, that's another big roadblock to this process, which we want to know what's on the other side. But the truth is that we can't explore all options truly until we actually play them out. But we can only really play one direction of life at a time. It's just the realities that we need to deal with, right? And so recognizing that we need to embrace some of this uncertainty and let our lives and our careers emerge. And one way I like, and because I talk to engineers a lot, right? They sometimes like this analogy of thinking of our careers and our lives as a set of experiments or prototypes, right? So each stage is another prototype. When you make a prototype, it's not just you're creating it for the purpose of collecting data. You're trying to get feedback and things like this, right? Or you're running an experiment, you're trying to collect data. You have a hypothesis, you think something might work, run the scientific method, you collect data, you see, hey, how did that match up against my hypothesis? Well, when you run an experiment, which could be making a career change, or you can run smaller experiments which say, hey, in my current job, could I raise my hand and try a side project or a new solution? Can I try something outside of my normal work? We can run smaller experiments, and it doesn't need to be a huge shift, but can we run these experiments or prototypes at different stages of our life and collect data? That it's a data collecting experience to say, hey, and so that's a positive thing. And if you find out that you don't like something, that's totally fine. You've collected that data, and now you can learn from that. You can still learn from that experience and take those new skills that you delivered. I think about me early in my career, I majored in mechanical engineering, but then I tried software for a few years. I realized that sitting down and writing code all day was just not my thing. And that's okay. But I learned a lot through that experience, and now I can talk to people who are in the software development world because of that experience. I understand Agile and Scrum and scoping out requirements for products and some of the challenges and opportunities. I can talk through that, and I'm really grateful for that experience, even though that wasn't the right, career path for me. That was totally fine, but I can take the value out of that, and I learned that as I took it, what I liked and didn't like, and into my next thing and my next thing, right? And so, these different things we're continuing to learn and grow through our lives and experiences. We need to accept that and have more of a growth mindset of like, hey, every opportunity is a learning opportunity.
Yeah. And, what you said there about what you run an experiment, you find out you don't like it. Most people say, well, then I failed. I tried something and I failed. And it's like, yeah. Okay, maybe, whatever. Moving on to the more productive way to look at it. We learned that you don't want that, or that you don't like that. And I always say to people, if they don't know what they want, let's start with what you absolutely don't want, right? Like, let's start with the things you absolutely hate. Because I'll get someone and they'll say, I'll say, where do you, like, what kind of company do you want to work at? Any kind of company. What kind of role? Any kind of role. What kind of industry? Any kind of industry. And it's like, that's not actually true, right?
Right.
And when people, and back, I used to always be like, well, who's the political person you dislike? Oh, here's the person. All right. Do you want to work for them? Gosh, no. And I go, then you have opinions. All right. Let's start with maybe you're just avoiding your opinions, avoiding your emotions because they're potentially too strong. Or, I was talking to someone and they said that they would always choose money over things that they liked, because they assumed that if they went after what they liked, that they would make less money. And obviously that's not always the case, right? And so trying to open people up to those different ways of looking at things. And I think one of the biggest things to pull from here is this idea that, like, someone will say to me, oh, I have so many different ways I could go, so many different options. And the truth is, you do have a lot of options, but you probably don't have as many options as you think. And I was chatting with someone, they're like, I could do any of like 50 different jobs. I'm like, yeah, but not in a reasonable time with a reasonable income to pay your rent. And so, and so these are things where it's like, we want to explore different opportunities. We want to test things and experiment. And we also want to eliminate options. And part of that eliminating of options, I think, is kind of realizing that, the choices we've made up to this point have actually already limited us in some ways. And that can be helpful to someone who's super overwhelmed, who thinks everything is a possibility. It's like, maybe I could be an artist or a teacher or go into finance. And I'm like, you know that there's some bumpers on this bowling alley that we can play with. So what are your thoughts around trying to help people? Because we as coaches, we want to expand people's options, but we also want them to make a decision. So it's this constant like sort of push and pull between expansion and pulling back. How do you sort of balance those two different areas in your work?
Yeah, it makes me think of the idea is like you can do anything, but you can't do everything, right? So you could do any of those things, right? But you can't do all of them all at once. And because, yeah, it's just, you can't do everything all at once. It's impossible. And so we do need to make choices, right? And so finding those bumpers that you say, or other things that can hone our focus, at least for now, and even saying like, hey, maybe where I want to go or something that's really interesting to me isn't possible today, or to at least do full time. Like if there's something you want to do, you can create parameters around what can I do now that can do anything to help me build that for the future. And if not in a full-time role or something that I can do right now, then maybe there's other learning things I can do on this side to move me towards that if that's what I want to do. So you do need to exist within realities. We do need to say, hey, I have some responsibilities. If you have a family to take care of or something like that, like you need to pay rent or pay the mortgage and some things like that. Like we need to find something that we can do now. Ideally, we want to make that as optimized as possible for our current situation and what we care about, but also what we want to build towards. And so like yes, like you're talking about, some things like we do have opinions. What do you not want to do? Sometimes that's easier for people to start with, but I do think it's much more powerful of a place to be in terms of setting goals and reaching towards things we want to become, is to move not just away from something that we don't want. Because I find people are in that situation a lot when they're coming to a coach or something like this, like, hey, I don't like where I'm at and I'm unhappy for X, Y, and Z reasons. Okay. And I got to get out of here. But I don't want people to just say, okay, I got to get out of here. We're just going to get something new. Mm-hmm. I do want people to identify what they want to move towards, because moving towards rather than moving away is a much stronger place to be mentally and emotionally. And builds more of that confidence so that they know where they're headed. And it's not to say that you can draw exactly a straight line to it immediately if there's something you want to try out, but we can identify what are some of the potential steps along the way that we might need to take to get there.
We interrupt today's episode to let you know about Career Therapy's Unstuck coaching program. If you're feeling paralyzed by job search procrastination and unsure of what to do next in your career, we're here to help. Each month as a member, you will get access to 2 one-on-one coaching calls, unlimited virtual chat with your coach via Slack, invitations to bi-weekly group coaching sessions, and lifetime access to our 8-part job search curriculum. Want to take your search to the next level? Head over to careertherapy.com and schedule a free 15-minute consultation to chat with me today and see if coaching is right for you. Now back to our show. I really like that. It's almost that anchoring between heaven and hell, right? It's like, you know what you're getting away from, but also know what you're running toward. Otherwise you might run right back into another fire, right? And right. We do see that all the time. We'll see someone be like, oh, I want to get out of this agency, or I want to get out of this company. And they just run right back to another company. It's kind of like, people in relationships, they leave one relationship and get right back into the exact same one with a different person, right? We also see, if you don't have a clear idea of what you're moving towards, you might end up just falling back. And I had someone say this to me recently. They're like, I can't really figure out what I want to do next. So maybe I'll just go back to my old job. And I was like, wait a second, there's a reason you left that job. Maybe we lost sight of that reason. It's like, I see this like thought going through your head real quick, but let's pause and reinstate what exactly it was that you were struggling with and open things up. And I do think that this
going back to that certainty of misery idea, like, because they know it, but they want that certainty because dealing with the uncertainty of the current moment is just so hard for them.
Totally. Oh my gosh. It's so, and it's also this, like, when we do look at the future, I think when people say they have so many options and that they don't know what they want to do next, really, they don't want to decide on something, because then they actually have to take action on it. Right.
Yeah.
And if I say, I really want this in my life, then there's a potential to fail at achieving it. If I never commit to it, well, then I'm never going to fail. Right. And so, and part of this is also wrapped up in, social pressures around success and what people think they should look like in the world. And, I talked to a number of people recently who, when we really dug into their motivations, I was like, what exactly is your motivation here? And they're like, well, my sibling is really successful and I want to be that successful, or my friends are all very successful and I want to be that successful. And we dug into it more and more. And, the sibling had actually burnt out in their job as a lawyer and ended up becoming a school teacher. And I was like, is anyone actually pressuring you? Like, is anyone treating you differently? Is anyone judging you for the life that you have? And they're like, no, but, and that but holds so much. And I'm curious, like, when you're dealing with all the various factors that influence someone's psychology as you're working with them, how do you help them navigate the many different voices and the shoulds that are in their head?
Yeah. So you use the word should. I had a friend tell me a couple of years ago, and I've loved it ever since. It's like, sometimes we say should. He said, don't should on yourself. Like, and so I really like that. Like, we say, oh, I should have done this or I should have done that. And like, whatever, like, don't should on yourself so much. And that comparison and social media, makes it, harder, because we only see the best of everyone. And we compare that to the worst of ourselves often, right? From a psychological standpoint. And so that makes it hard. And family, friends, people we graduated with, and we look at them and what they're doing, whatever. First of all, recognize you don't know everything's going on. Second of all, like, if someone's doing well, congratulations to them. Don't look at that as a knock on you. Like, can we celebrate other people and their success? Like, that's a good thing. Like, we want other people to be happy. It's okay. Like, that doesn't need to make you feel bad about yourself. Hopefully we can look at that as an opportunity, and but taking that negative comparison doesn't do any good for us or them or anyone else around us. But I think, saying like, okay, like, maybe there were some decisions that we look back on and we have regret. Sometimes we have this idea of like, hey, we want to live without regrets. Okay, sometimes that can be okay. I actually read a few months ago the book by Daniel Pink, who's written a number of books, The Power of Regret, and how regret is not a bad thing. Like, regret, it gives us this opportunity to learn and grow. If there's something that we did that we regret, well, instead of like suppressing that thing, like, oh, that sucks, like, hey, can I learn from that experience? Like, that's part of life. We make mistakes and we learn from it, and that's okay. But the empowering way to look at it is like, what can I do from here? Instead of feeling like fixed, like, hey, I failed once, that means I'm always going to be a failure. And that's not true. It doesn't have to be true anyway, if we can get the help and the support and really come to believe in ourselves and start taking appropriate action as we move forward. That's what breaks my heart as much as anything when I talk to people, is they get to that point where they feel like they've tried and failed, and then they just kind of give up and they're like, what's the point? And that's a tough place to see someone in, whether that's a client or a friend or family member or anyone else. And so, that's one of the reasons why we need people who care about us, who support us in our lives, that these changes, life in general is not meant to be lived alone. And we need to have that support from people around us to help us through the good times and the bad times as we move through it.
Yeah. And that feeling of what's the point, right? That's so deep, and trying to help people rediscover what the point is for them is personally good for them, obviously mentally good for them, also professionally good for them, because there is a point. Like, they wouldn't have come to coaching if there wasn't a point, right? And I think we just get lost in it and we get caught up in these emotions, these feelings of failure. And I'm, you brought up that really heavy piece of failure, right? And, I even get some folks who, there's the folks that feel like they failed, but then there's folks who are just like, the regrets are things that were totally out of their control. It's like I was sick,
Yeah.
or we moved, or something happened with my family, or I'm,
Right.
had to immigrate, or whatever the thing is. And like, even those things almost feel like it's their fault, the way that they talk about
Yeah.
it. And it's one of the toughest parts to maybe get into as a coach, because there's boundaries of how deep you can go and things like that.
Mhm.
But it all does impact it, because it impacts the motivation, and it impacts the drive, and it impacts the excitement that they can bring to things. And, a huge part of the job search is networking, but how do you network when you feel this way? Right? How do you
Yeah.
go out and have an engaging conversation with someone if you really aren't feeling like you even deserve a job at a certain point?
Or if you feel like you've been hurt by other people or harassed in the workplace, you're like, how do I trust anyone, to really like build a reasonable professional relationship in that way when you've been hurt in the past in some cases. So again, some things that are out of your control. But it creates that fear and that anxiety around, why would I want to do this? What's the point?
Well, and that, let's dig into that more, because I do think that a lot of, this is career therapy, right? So a lot of people who are listening are dealing with the heavy emotions, right? And I think it's so interesting, because we've got probably overlapping but different kind of audiences. And I think you had the engineering stuff that you talked about earlier, I think is really fascinating, and the hypothesis and test. And I don't think that most professions are kind of built with that mentality of like everything is a test, everything is an experiment. I think most professions are right or wrong. It's binary. Everything is binary. And being able to get into the gray and being okay with the things that are happening in the gray, I think is a really important step for people to get to, because that's where you can start pushing on the boundaries, right? If it's either failure or success, there's no room for error, right? If it's I job searched today perfectly, or I didn't do enough, it just builds and builds and builds. So, what are some other maybe differences that you've seen in engineering populations, or maybe even similarities, and in the way that they approach these problems with maybe a little bit more of a technical mindset?
Yeah, and recognize, I don't think that engineers necessarily do this naturally better than anyone else, because it's using my own example. So I got into engineering. I knew from when I was an early teenager that I wanted to be an engineer. I had some natural tendencies towards math and science and stuff. People were like, hey, engineering could be a great fit for you. And I was like, okay, cool. I looked in what some of the things I could do. Oh, I can work on cars and airplanes and spaceships and stuff. Like that's possibility. Okay, cool. I decided, I think I was in ninth grade, that I want to be a mechanical engineer. Never changed my major and all that stuff. But one of the things I really loved about it, or loved about math and science classes and things like that, is that there was always that right or wrong answer. Like if I was right, and I was good at it naturally. So I was right a lot, and I really liked that feeling. And if I was wrong, I could easily see why. But on the contrast, me personally, I see this in a lot of engineers and other people too. Sometimes the creative pieces, writing, art, and some things like that. I said, hey, this is subjective. Someone just is going to give their opinion and going to give me a grade on this. Like that's hard for me. And so I actively avoided those things for years, for a long time, because I wanted to know if I was going to do something, that there was a right or wrong answer and I could fix it if I was wrong. Whereas if I was just getting someone else's opinion, that was much harder for me, where it was subjective. But come to find out, life is a lot more subjective than objective, like I liked when it was easy in school, right? And so I find that a lot of engineers are like that, and that's some of the things that they really like. And so one of the things that they struggle with then in getting into these life decisions is that when it comes to themselves, they do still kind of see that in binary. They focus on themselves, even when they're working on a project or a product that's maybe easier, but they don't always apply those same principles to themselves. right? Like the decisions that I make about me, like running an experiment, which is why I try and connect them with those ideas that they can relate with, they understand, try and bring that closer to them. But it is hard for so many people. Just one concept that can help as we're trying to navigate through failures and opportunities and how we're growing and things through life. I really loved a book that was written a year or so ago by a psychologist by the name of Benjamin Hardy in partnership with Dan Sullivan, who is an entrepreneurship coach. And it's called The Gap and the Gain. And it's this idea that so often in our lives, we focus so much on the gap, okay? The gap between where we are today and this ideal person or situation that we wish that we were in, that we think could be possible, right? And so we're focusing so much on this gap. It's like this feeling of lack that we're in. And it's almost like you're climbing a mountain. You've been climbing for hours or days, if anyone's ever gone on a long hike a day, and you've been going for hours, and then you look up at where you're headed at the peak, and you're like, oh my gosh, I still have so much more to go. And I've been working so hard, and I still see that there's so much more to go. But then you turn around and you look down at where you come from, like down in the valley, like that's the opportunity to look at the gain. Like, look how far you've come compared to where you used to be. Can we spend some time recognizing, and this is, connecting with the research around gratitude and things as well, like looking at the wins, the progress, the opportunities, the good people we've met, the things that we've learned, all these things. We need to spend some time looking at the gain that we've looked at as well, and look at potential opportunities in the future as like, hey, this may or may not work out, but can I look at this as an opportunity to get some more gain and progress, no matter what that looks like too. So it's just one principle that I've used to sometimes when people are in that really low spot, we even design like a little activity to say, hey, let's just spend some more time in the gain and see how we can look at the progress. And I do that for myself on a regular basis now, ever since I learned about it. And it helps me kind of crawl out of some negative times that I'm in.
Yeah. Well, and I think people don't always realize, like, coaches, therapists, anyone who's trying to help you is also going through stuff. And like, that is,
we're all humans.
It's like all these things that we do that people feel in their careers. It's like everyone feels them, no matter where you're at in your career. You've probably felt it at some point, or maybe there's, I'm sure there's a percentage that don't, but for the most part, people are dealing with stress and anxiety at pretty high levels. And I do think things like gratitude and everything that you just mentioned there is really important. And, as I'm thinking through this concept of like this gap of who we are today and who we think we should be, right? And this is going back to shooting all over ourselves, right? And it really brings up this odd juxtaposition where you ask someone, what do you want your career to look like? And they can't articulate that. But then you ask them, well, what's wrong with your current job? And they go, well, I'm not where I should be. And you're like, okay, so where should you be? And they're like, I can't articulate that. And you're like, all right. So it's a loop. And you get this really interesting thing happen. And I think that there's this, I put a note down here called the subjective disconnect, because you were talking about the subjectivity of the job search. And the subjective disconnect in my mind is like, I feel like people have this abstract, I could be perfect. And this goes back to that binary, there's going to be a perfect answer of what my career should be, etc. But it's like, I could be perfect. I could have a perfect career, but I'm just not there yet. And maybe this is sold to us. Maybe this is something culturally deep. But the truth is that there is no perfect career, because as soon as you get to a place, it normalizes. And that's one of the great things about being human, is that we can pretty much normalize any situation, bad or good. But we get somewhere, it normalizes, and then it plateaus, and then we want to change. And so even the perfect job, the dream job, as every coach says it, when you get to the dream job, it's only a dream for a bit. And maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 5 months. But eventually you go, uh-oh, there's something else, or the team changed, or who knows what it is. And so we have this disconnect between who we are today and who we imagine we should be. And I think the hardest part of the job search is that we go out and we interview and we get told no, but we get no feedback. So we already have a negative self-perception that might be rooted in some of the feelings of failure, feelings of loss, and things that we've talked about. Then you go put yourself out there a little bit, get rejected, don't get any feedback. So you go, well, there's now a disconnect between their subjective view of me. So I'm just going to fill it in with my negativity, right? Whereas it might have just been something as simple as, oh, I liked them, but this person works here, or something, something really simple. And so you end up with this like huge gap between who you are and who you think you are, and this huge gap between what people think of you, but you don't know what they think of you. So you just fill it in with this, like this empty space. How have you sort of seen that come up with the clients, maybe with imposter syndrome or with any number of different things that could arise?
Yeah, imposter syndrome is a big deal. And you talk about like this lack of feedback. Love a quote by Brene Brown. If you're familiar with her, it says, in the absence of data, we make up stories, right? And we do that as humans because we're mean-making machines. Someone did something or said something, or we got to know. We're trying to connect the what happened with why that happened. We're trying to create meaning around that. But if we don't have actual factual data or information or actual feedback around that, then we're trying to fill in that space. But the truth is that oftentimes we're doing that in a way that is unhelpful. So. And we do that not just in like, hey, we have an interview and we get a no, but we do that when we're working and someone says something that we feel is hurtful to us. And instead of considering, why, we try and figure out why they said it instead of really understanding that or looking at just the facts. They said this, were they really trying to hurt us? Maybe, but maybe not. Two, we don't actually know that. Because we're not in their heads. She also used this idea so many times, like, hey, do you think that everyone is doing the best that they can? Right? And that's sometimes a hard question to answer. Like, do I really feel, especially if we're looking at like people that might have hurt us in the past, or we feel wronged by in some way, like, are people really doing the best that they can? And she was struggling with, like, I don't know, like this person's a jerk. They can't be doing the best they can, this, that, and the other. But then I think it's still Brene Brown we're talking about. She had this conversation with her husband, and she asked this question to him. He's like, and he thought about it for a moment. It's like, I don't know if everyone is. But I think that if I assume that people are doing the best they can, then my life will be better and happier. And that's been interesting for me to connect with on a number of ways. So like imposter syndrome, to go back to that, I've had plenty of people who are like, hey, like I have this feeling of imposter syndrome. Should I take the approach like fake it till I make it? Right? Because that doesn't feel authentic to people if they're kind of faking it. And I don't really resonate with the whole fake it till you make it idea anyway, but I heard someone else say a number of months ago, and I really liked it. This idea, it's not fake it till you make it, but maybe a more positive way of looking at it is practice until you become it. Okay. Like we're never gonna necessarily get to this point where we have it all figured out, that everything's perfect and everything, but we always have room to grow. And so we're just in the state of practicing. We're not faking it, we're practicing. And then eventually more and more practice, we gain expertise and skills and things. We learn and grow and we become something new in almost any area of our lives. But for people who are like me, perhaps, who are recovering perfectionists, who are trying to deal with, I want to be perfect right now. I've had to come to the point like, hey, the fact that I will never be in that perfect state, instead of being really frustrated with that, and like, I'm never going to be perfect in whatever area of my life that I really care about or want to be, even that can be looked at as an opportunity, because what that means is there's always something for me to grow in, and I can look at that as a positive, not as a negative. So that's a cool opportunity for me to look forward towards growth. And I have to keep reminding myself of this, but look forward towards growth rather than just frustrated with my lack or that gap like we were talking about earlier. So I just shared a whole lot of concepts there. Maybe we went on too many tangents.
No, it's great. I love it.
Fun things for me to talk about.
I love it. I've got notes here. So a few things. The first thing I want to touch on is the last thing you said. We have to keep reminding ourselves of it. And I want to reiterate, like, your coaches, your therapists, everyone has to keep reminding themselves of these things, because it is so easy to just almost get into, I don't know, let's say almost a lazy thinking, which I guess is a bit blameful. But this concept of just like, it's so easy to just assume that people aren't doing their best. The person, I think it's forget who the writer was, but someone cuts you off on the freeway. You can assume that they're an a-hole, or you can assume that they're taking their kid to the hospital. Which one is more helpful to you? And all of these things, right? And so we get into this place where, basically what you're saying is assume good intent, right?
Yes,
and I think it goes beyond that, like assume good intent in others, but also assume good intent in yourself. So if everyone else is doing the best that they can, I think maybe one of the reasons we think they aren't is because on some level we don't think we are, right? Well, I know I could do better, so that means everyone could do better. So I'm going to project the anger I have for myself towards others, right? I put in all this work and frustrated myself and beat myself up to get this interview, and then you didn't give me the job, so now I'm mad at you, right? And it is this sort of, it just degrades the whole process. It erodes everything. And so it's not ultimately helpful. Where, let's say you had a day, and I was helping someone plan out their day today, and they were getting really caught up in, like, they use a Pomodoro technique, and they were like, I need to do 5 Pomodoros today, and then I can, go to yoga and all these other things. And it was really cool how they were putting it all together and laying it all out. And right before we ended the call, I go, and if you only hit 75% success rate with all this stuff, be happy with it. Like managing the expectation of, like, again, overcoming that perfectionism, because if you shoot for, 100% and don't hit it, and then beat yourself up for doing 75, that's, counterproductive, so much more counterproductive. And so giving ourselves a little bit of that good intent as well. And I do think that a lot of people, they just think, I should be a machine. I should be able to work with no sleep, and work with no sunshine, and work with no food. I don't even know. It's like, we hit this point where people, you go online, you hear everything, but people say, like, you're finding a job should be your full-time job. And I always lament that on this podcast, because I'm like, you really think that you could be your own boss and not drive yourself insane for 8 hours a day? Like, that's just, you're going to be a bad employee and a bad boss, and you're going to burn yourself out. And I always say, like, sit down and do the job search one day and see at what point, monitor yourself. At what point do you get exhausted? At what point do you get tired? At what point can you not do this anymore? And then do that for a few days, find the average, and then maybe make that your goal. Because I'd much rather you do 2 hours a day for a whole week than 8 hours one day and nothing for 2 weeks, And this is that sort of, I think, tuning in with ourselves and bringing in all the different aspects of what we're talking about. It's how we think about ourselves, how we physically experience it, how we emotionally experience it, and bringing all those pieces together so that we can continue to remain in forward momentum and not get stuck and not move backwards. Because I think that, again, it's so easy to just go back to the bad thing that's comfortable than to keep moving forward. So as you think about all these different aspects, and we think about this idea of growing up, I think this question is quite fun, because it's, what do I want to be when I grow up? As though being grown up is a single spot that you reach. Like, Oh, when I was talking to a 50-year-old yesterday, and they were like, what, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. I'm like, yeah, we're all grown-ups. I don't know what to break it to you. We already are the things. We are
Yeah.
ourselves. It's like, what do I want to be? It's you already are the things. So maybe stop trying to figure out what you are and just relax into it. And I'm curious, as you sort of think about that question, it's like, if it's not going to be a single point of I'm grown up and now I'm there, what's maybe a simpler way to conceptualize it so that people can relax a little bit, or just kind of take this all in stride?
Yeah, it's a tough place to be because or think about, because this idea of being, a lot of times in the context of what we're talking about is usually in a career, like what's the role, like what do I want to be when I grow up? That's usually what people are thinking about when they think about that question. I want to be a firefighter or an astronaut or a lawyer or a doctor or this, that, or the other, right? Or an engineer. But that a career title or role or situation is just one piece of who we are as a person, right? But we often internalize that way too much as part of what our identity is, which is part of why I named my company More Than Engineering, because I'm talking to engineers, but I want engineers and technology professionals to think that you are more than just like what this thing is. Like we want to look at the whole person here, right? So when you think about what do I want to be, yeah, asking yourself that question, what do you want to be? Not just like the title you want to be, but what kind of person? What kind of spouse or partner? What kind of brother or sister or friend or community member, right? What sort of employee or colleague do you want to be? And so rather than sometimes like, compressing it, sometimes I want to look at like, okay, what's the person that you want to be, right? And the whole person, and driven by values that you can identify, right? And it's not that you're gonna, again, it's not gonna be at this point where like suddenly you've arrived. But if we can live our lives driven more, that we need to keep reminding ourselves of the purpose, the reason why we care about these things, what's important to us, and continue to make decisions based on that, then we're much more likely to be driven to a point of, becoming a person that we are proud of, and others might be proud of, but that we are proud of who we have become and the ways that we have grown and developed, certainly in our careers and in other aspects of life. So I just want to broaden that and say, hey, like we're all on kind of this journey. Give other people, assume positive intent in others, assume positive intent in ourselves, but keep trying to identify those things that you really care about and who you want to become, and make decisions based on that. And over time, we're going to keep making progress. And if we're intentional about this, but if we just let life and careers and situations happen to us, then we might not grow as much as we otherwise could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love everything you're saying there, because it really, it comes down to this picture in our head of, again, what it is versus what it should be versus what is reality, right? And I was chatting with someone the other day, and they asked, like, is it okay to not want a ton of responsibility in my career? And I was like, yeah. You think I'm going to work with a career coach, I'm going to make so much more money. It's like, maybe working with a career coach is reassessing your time or your energy or how your career fits into your life and your hobbies and your family and things like that. And they sort of just hit a point where they're like, no one's pushing me to make more money. I don't need to necessarily make more money. I just feel like I should be doing that. And I was like, for what goal? If it takes you away from the things that you actually want in life, right? And there's plenty of examples of people. As a matter of fact, the majority of people are not the CEO of the company, are not the, founder.
Very few.
Of it's like, literally, it's a bell curve, right? Like, it's okay to be in the average. Like, maybe you don't want to be at the bottom of the average, but you don't necessarily have to be unhappy with where you're at when you're doing well. And I think that's maybe one of the hardest parts of our careers is just thousands of people who are doing well, who don't actually have any real problems going on, but feel like there's a problem because of whatever the expectations internally, externally that there are. And so I think I appreciate you kind of going through all these different ways to rethink and reframe, because there's so many different ways we can do this. There's no one single path. What are your final thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I just think of a few of my clients that I've worked with. Like I think I mentioned earlier, like I had one who was like, I want to find my happy place. And we did some of that. He thought that finding his happy place was like a new career position. He thought, and we had the idea that we were going to work on that. But I work with people on mindsets and kind of how they view things. He had some pretty negative and tough career situations up to this point. He'd been in his career like 25 years. He had some tough things, and he had some pretty some experiences that kind of left him down on his self-image in a lot of ways. And what we realized in the end is like, by the time we finished working together, he still had some more work that he was going to be doing after the fact. He hadn't changed positions, but he had changed how he was operating in his current situation. So it wasn't that the grass is going to be greener on the other side, but who he was in his situation changed. And he was in a much happier place compared to him thinking that he needed to get to a different place to be happier. Right.
That's huge.
And so it's not that. And then, by the way, a few months later, he did find a new role that he's really enjoying even more, and he's thriving there even more. But he changed himself first. Right. And we can do that, like, change ourselves. So coaches, therapists, and others, there is a difference, as we know.
Very much.
But these people in our life, and even just family or friends that can support us and help us through things. We can get that support. We don't need to subscribe to other people or society or other expectation setting goals for us. We can identify what we really care about. And if making more money than everyone else is not what we care about, totally fine. Plenty of people that make a lot of money that aren't that happy or satisfied with their lives. And not that money's bad, but if you can identify what matters to you, then you can make decisions in your life based on that and grow accordingly.
I think it's a perfect spot to end on. If people want to find out more about what you're doing, Jeff, where should they go?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So I put together a thing just for listeners of the Career Therapy Podcast, a page they can go at www.engineeringcareeraccelerator.com/career therapy. And they do need to put those W's in there to make it work. But for it's called my Career Clarity Checklist. So a lot of the things that we were talking about today to allow them to have some resources, some exercise and things. And this isn't a one-time deal, but it's something you can do today. And then you can go back in a month or a year or a few years from now, some of these activities to help continue to refresh as we go through these different stages of our careers and understand what's most important to you. So if you're not sure how to figure this out, we've talked about this thing pretty high level. This Career Clarity Checklist can help you move through some of those exercises to identify that for you. So again, www.engineeringcareeraccelerator.com/career therapy. Pretty active on LinkedIn. You can also go to my website at morethaneng.com to see some more resources and things. But and final thing, I'm throwing way too many things at you. Any other podcast listeners, I host another podcast especially for engineers and technology people, the Engineering Career Coach Podcast. Go check that out if you're interested. So thanks for having me. It's been so much fun.
Thanks for joining us, Jeff. And all those links will be in the description for everyone to check out. Again, thank you for your time and for sharing your insights. I think there are some really cool things in here for people to take away. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you found this conversation to be helpful, please like and subscribe wherever you are listening. We also appreciate it if you take the time to leave us a review on iTunes. It really does help us spread the word and get these ideas out to more job seekers looking to build their careers and improve their lives just like you. If you'd like to learn more about career therapy and see our different coaching options, you can head over to careertherapy.com to learn more. Thank you again for stopping by. We wish you all the best in the future of your career. Have a good one.